Imagine walking into just a normal public kindergarten classroom in the American Midwest.
Right.
You look around and you see kids playing, they're learning to read, doing arts and crafts. And to most people, that's just, a scene of absolute unremarkable innocence.
Totally normal.
Yeah, exactly. But what if a growing, highly mobilized political faction looked at that exact same room and concluded they were witnessing the literal military conquest of their country?
Which sounds completely absurd to a lot of people.
Right. It sounds absurd, but to a very powerful movement that's frankly reshaping elections across the globe right now, it is absolute undeniable reality. So welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today, we are wading into some deeply turbulent waters.
Very turbulent.
Yeah. Our mission today is to dissect a highly charged, really complex YouTube transcript. It's from the channel Raymond Ibrahim, and he's featuring a guest, this academic and journalist, Ralph Schawhammer. And the topic is, demographic change in the West, immigration, cultural assimilation, and these stark existential claims they make about Islam and Western civilization.
And before we go a single step further, we need to establish a very firm boundary for this deep dive.
Yeah, please. This is crucial.
The source material we're examining today contains intense, politically polarizing, and, highly controversial viewpoints regarding religion, race, and the fundamental survival of cultures. So we want to be absolutely explicit with you, the listener.
Right.
We are not endorsing, we are not validating or taking sides on any of the political or cultural viewpoints presented by these sources. Our goal here is strictly analytical. We are acting as neutral cartographers, basically.
It's just mapping out the logic they're using.
Exactly. We're conveying the ideas contained in the original source material. The purpose is to help you understand the internal architecture of this specific worldview. Because, grasping the mechanics of this narrative is absolutely essential to understanding a massive piece of the modern geopolitical puzzle.
Right, because if you want to understand modern political polarization, if you really want to know why populist and nationalist movements are surging across the U.S. and Europe, you can't just look at poll numbers.
No, polls don't tell you the why.
Exactly. You have to look at the media people are actually consuming, the frameworks they're using to process reality. And this transcript gives us a front row seat to those underlying fears and the highly specific vocabulary they use to articulate them. So let's begin right where our source material starts, with a viral social media post, because it really acts as the inciting incident for this entire worldview.
Yeah, the catalyst for their whole discussion is a post on Truth Social. And it was shared by former U.S. President Donald Trump.
Right.
He basically amplified a post originally from an account called End Wokeness.
Hey.
And the post itself was simply a short video with a two-word caption that just said, "The facts."
And the video itself, what was it?
It showed a public kindergarten class in St. Paul, Minnesota, where every single young girl in the frame was wearing a hijab.
And the reaction to the single post was just this immediate, massive explosion. It fractured completely along ideological lines.
Well, absolutely.
You had figures like Minnesota Governor Tim Walz and organizations like the Council on American Islamic Relations, KR, coming out with these fierce condemnations.
Right.
KR issued statements framing the post as an act of targeting Muslim children, arguing that it, validated hatred and put the physical safety of kindergartners at risk. And the governor criticized it for attacking students based on their religious attire. The dominant narrative on one side was, this is a malicious, dangerous dog whistle aimed at innocent kids.
But our sources, Ibrahim and Schawhammer, they look at that exact same video and the exact same public backlash, and they draw a completely inverted conclusion.
Yeah, they see it entirely differently.
Ibrahim points out that the original post was quite literally just stating the facts. He emphasizes that no one in the media or the government disputed the authenticity of the video.
Right. It's a real school.
Those are real students. So the speakers express this deep frustration that simply documenting a visible changing demographic reality is instantly classified by institutions as an act of evil or, a public safety threat.
It really functions as the ultimate social media Rorschach test.
That's a great way to put it.
One side looks at a video and sees children learning, and they perceive the very act of sharing the video as a threat against minorities. But the other side looks at the exact same pixels on a screen and sees the literal erasure of their own cultural identity. They look at that kindergarten class and see undeniable, on-the-ground evidence of demographic replacement.
And to justify that perspective, to explain why they view a classroom as a civilizational threat, The speakers introduce this thought experiment.
The Saudi Arabia one, right?
Yeah, the Saudi Arabia thought experiment. They use it to highlight what they see as Western hypocrisy. They ask you to imagine traveling to a major city in Saudi Arabia. But instead of seeing a native Saudi population, you find the entire city populated almost exclusively by Europeans.
Okay.
And imagine these Europeans are dressed in traditional European clothing, wearing prominent Christian crosses, and openly declaring, this is our country now.
Wow.
The sources argue that if that scenario occurred, the Saudis would be completely justified in their outrage. And furthermore, they argue the entire global community, the UN, progressive activists, everyone would acknowledge that the host country was being colonized, that its heritage was being lost.
Right.
So they use this analogy to posit that a dramatic, visible demographic shift is universally recognized as a profound loss of national identity, except when it happens to Western nations.
But let me push back on the mechanics of that leap for a second, because the speakers claim they're just, stating facts. But the framing of a fact does an enormous amount of heavy lifting.
It absolutely does.
A video of a classroom is a fact. Claiming that this classroom proves America's becoming a Somali experiment is an interpretation. So how do the speakers intellectually justify moving from a short video of children in Minnesota to these sweeping assertions about civilizational collapse?
Well, they bridge that intellectual gap by connecting the visible demographic shift that Chief does at the classroom to broader economic friction and systemic exploitation. They refuse to view the hijab simply as an item of clothing. They view it as the flag of a competing civilizational operating system. And to anchor this argument, they bring up a specific massive anecdote from the source material. A recent $350 million welfare fraud case in Minnesota.
$350 million, that's huge.
Right. And the speakers assert that the vast majority of the individuals indicted in this particular scam were Somali immigrants.
But they don't just frame this as standard, white-collar criminality, do they?
No, not at all. They attach this highly specific ancient theological lens to it, which completely changes the nature of the crime in their eyes. They introduce the concept of jizya.
Jizya, can you explain what that is?
Historically, jizya was a financial tax levied by Islamic states on specific non-Muslim subjects, known as dhimmi, who permanently resided in Muslim lands. The speakers in our source explicitly use this historical concept to reframe modern welfare fraud. They argue that these immigrant populations aren't just standard grifters exploiting the system. Instead, they suggest these individuals view welfare fraud as extracting their rightful jizya from the foolish infidels.
Wow.
Yeah. They're taking modern criminal behavior and mapping a 7th century religious warfare justification directly onto it.
Think about how radically that changes a listener's worldview. If you accept their premise, a person stealing from a government program isn't just a thief. They're a holy warrior continuing an ancient civilizational conquest through, bureaucratic means.
It turns every interaction into a religious battleground.
Exactly. It turns every point of societal friction into a war. They're effectively arguing that assimilation is a myth, that immigrants aren't coming to Minnesota to become Midwesterners, but are instead bringing an adversarial parallel system with them. But how do they prove that this system is inherently hostile? To justify such a severe assessment of their fellow citizens, they argue you have to look at the origins of these populations.
Yes. And this leads us directly to their core methodological argument. We can call it the native habitat litmus test.
Native habitat?
The speakers posit that you cannot accurately judge an ideology, a culture, or a religion by how its adherents behave when they are a vulnerable minority living in a Western secular society.
They specifically mock the common defense people use, what I'd call the friendly cab driver illusion.
Yes.
The idea that, I know a guy from Somalia, or I have a Pakistani accountant, and he's incredibly nice and loves baseball, so the culture he comes from must be perfectly compatible with ours.
Right, because everyone has those anecdotes.
Yeah. Think about your own neighborhood. We all have these friendly interactions, and we usually use them as proof that integration works.
But the sources dismiss those everyday interactions as entirely superficial. They argue that a person's demeanor at their job tells you absolutely nothing about the deep-seated moral values they hold in private, or, importantly, what political structures they would vote for if they held demographic dominance.
Okay, so if you can't look at how they act here, where do you look?
They insist that to truly understand the DNA of a culture, you must observe it in its native habitat, the geographical location where that culture holds absolute majority power, controls the institutions, and dictates the laws and social norms without any Western secular restraints.
And the source material provides three very grim specific case studies to illustrate this native habitat theory. Let's look at the first one, which is Somalia. They used Somalia as the ultimate litmus test to explain their anxiety about the Somali immigrants they were discussing in Minnesota.
Right, and Somalia is presented in the source not merely as a tragic failed state, but as a radically Islamic one operating exactly as its cultural DNA intends.
They cite a specific list, right?
Yes, the Open Doors World Watch List. It's an annual report ranking the 50 nations where Christians face the most severe persecution. And the speakers point out that while North Korea is habitually ranked #1 due to its totalitarian atheism,
Sure.
Somalia is consistently right behind it, usually at #2.
Right.
They detail how in Somalia, radical groups like Al-Shabaab will actively hunt and kill Christians on sight. The argument is that you cannot be an open Christian in that society without facing immediate lethal violence.
Their underlying logic here is heavily deterministic. They're basically asking if Somalia represents the most radical culture on earth in terms of its violent treatment of religious minorities, why would anyone assume that individuals socialized in that culture suddenly abandon those deep-rooted views the exact moment they step off a commercial flight in Minneapolis? They argue that underlying hostility might be temporarily concealed out of necessity just to survive in a new country, but the foundational worldview remains intact. And it's not just a geopolitical theory for them, right? Raymond Ibrahim actually brings in his own personal heritage to cement this point.
He does. Ibrahim specifically discusses his Coptic Egyptian background. To illustrate the native habitat behavior, he cites an incident that had recently occurred in a village in Minya, Egypt.
What happened there?
According to his account, a sudden uprising occurred where the Muslim majority turned against the Coptic Christian minority. He describes a terrifying scene. A priest's car was set on fire. Christians were physically trapped inside a church, the electricity was deliberately cut off to blind them, and they were subjected to stoning.
That's horrifying.
And crucially, Ibrahim claims that local Egyptian authorities and police simply stood by and allowed it to happen, even after being provided with video footage of previous similar attacks.
So he uses that terrifying anecdote to establish a baseline. He's saying, look, this is not an anomaly. This is how this specific culture behaves when it has the power of the majority. It treats the religious minority as functionally subhuman.
Yes.
And then the source material takes this concept of the native habitat and draws a direct, dark line straight into the heart of Western Europe, specifically connecting Pakistan to the United Kingdom.
This is where their deterministic view of culture becomes highly operationalized. They first established the native habitat baseline in Pakistan, describing a systemic environment where religious minorities like Hindus and Christians, who each make up roughly 1% of the population, are routinely preyed upon.
Right.
They cite ongoing systemic issues where young minority girls are abducted, forced into Islamic marriages, and forcefully converted, while the local police and judiciary remain entirely complicit, denying the victims' families any legal recourse.
Then they take that behavioral pattern from Pakistan and map it directly onto the highly publicized grooming gang scandals that rocked the UK over the last decade.
Yes. The speakers emphasize that the perpetrators in the UK grooming gangs were overwhelmingly men of Pakistani descent. Their thesis is that this highly predatory tribalistic mentality, a system where the in-group feels entitled to prey upon the vulnerable girls of the out-group or the infidel, with total impunity, was not somehow generated by British inequality or poverty.
No, they think it was imported.
Exactly. They argue it was simply transplanted intact from the villages of Pakistan directly into an open, liberal, and entirely unprepared British society.
Let's really pull apart this methodology because it fundamentally rewrites how a listener is supposed to view their fellow citizens. The speakers are pushing a highly deterministic view of human culture. They are entirely rejecting the foundational Western liberal ideal that geographical relocation and exposure to democratic institutions change a person's foundational values.
Totally rejecting it.
They are declaring that culture is perfectly portable. If a culture is violently hostile in its native habitat, it will be quietly hostile in its new habitat until it gains enough numbers to be violently hostile again.
And the determinism goes even deeper when they apply it to physical symbols. Let's look back at the hijab in the kindergarten video.
Okay.
In a liberal framework, a hijab or a specific style of untrimmed beard is viewed as a benign, personal religious choice, protected by freedom of expression. Our sources entirely reject that. They view these garments as physical, visible indicators of a literal fundamentalist adherence to a specific worldview.
And in their calculus, literal adherence to Islam equates inevitably to a militant, dangerous ideology.
Exactly. Their assumption is that if an individual is fundamentalist enough to strictly follow the 7th century dress code, they are highly likely to harbor the theological enmity toward the infidel that the speakers claim is inherent in the religious texts.
The source material even brings up a medieval military term to categorize modern migration. During a segment interacting with their audience, a viewer in the super chats introduces the term ribat, and the hosts immediately validate it. Can you explain what a ribat is and how it functions in this narrative?
Sure. Historically, a ribat was an Arabic term used to describe a frontier fortification or a border fort. During periods of historical Islamic expansion, when Muslim forces would wage military campaigns and push into non-Muslim territories, they would construct these rebats wherever their forward advance was temporarily halted.
Okay.
It wasn't just a defensive wall, it was a stronghold, a deeply entrenched forward operating base from which they could launch ongoing raids, consolidate their power, and slowly edge further into enemy territory over generations.
Mapping a medieval military fortress onto a modern European city is a massive psychological leap.
It really is.
I mean, they are looking at Muslim enclaves in places like London, Paris, or Malmo and categorizing them as modern-day rebats. This entirely strips away the civilian nature of immigration.
Right, it frames it as an invasion.
Exactly. It frames migration not as individuals seeking economic opportunity or escaping war or looking for a better life, which is, the standard sociological view, but as a slow, strategic, multi-generational military invasion. It recasts every migrant as a vanguard of a conquering army.
Which naturally forces a massive, glaring question to the surface. If this incoming culture is so inherently incompatible, so unyielding, and so dangerous to the host nation, as the sources vehemently claim, why on earth does the West eagerly invite it in?
Yeah, why do Western governments actively facilitate the arrival and subsidization of millions of people who, according to the specific worldview, hold values diametrically opposed to the survival of Western civilization?
Well, to answer that, the speakers pivot away from the immigrants themselves and point the finger directly at a catastrophic philosophical shift within Western thinking. They argue the West has fallen victim to what they call the materialist illusion.
The materialist illusion.
Yeah, they claim that Western institutions have been entirely gaslit into operating under a Marxist or materialist paradigm.
We really need to define exactly what they mean by materialist in this context, because they aren't just talking about consumerism or buying expensive cars.
No. They are talking about a fundamental theory of human nature. They argue that the modern Western state operates on the philosophical assumption that all human beings are fundamentally identical, interchangeable blank slates.
Okay.
In this materialist paradigm, a person's culture, their ancient religion, their historical grievances, and their philosophical heritage are considered completely superfluous, just window dressing. The operating theory of modern Western governments is that human behavior is driven solely by material conditions.
So if you just give them stuff.
Exactly. Therefore, if you take anyone from any culture on Earth and provide them with a good job, a modern apartment, and legal equality material goods, they will magically and inevitably shed their ancient tribal identities and become model, secular Western citizens.
And the sources believe this is a suicidal, historically illiterate delusion. So what is the opposite of materialism to them? It's the belief that culture and spiritual worldview are the primary drivers of human behavior, not economics. And this leads them to a blistering critique of multiculturalism. They argue that multiculturalism, as practiced by modern governments, is an absolute joke because it treats culture as mere aesthetics. It reduces deep, ancient, sometimes blood-soaked identities to neighborhood food festivals, colorful parades, and traditional dress.
Yes. It completely ignores that culture is actually about deep-seated moral foundations, irreconcilable worldviews, and fundamental views on the rights of women, the rule of law, and religious supremacy.
And to highlight how unique this modern delusion is, they draw a sharp contrast between current immigration policies and historical immigration to the Americas and Europe.
They do. They readily acknowledge that early America was a chaotic hodgepodge of different ethnic groups, Swedes, Germans, English, Irish, Italians. But they claim that this early American melting pot was successful solely because those immigrants, despite their linguistic and national differences, shared an overarching foundational European heritage. They argue these groups were bound together by the deep, unspoken connecting tissue of Christendom and a shared philosophical lineage that goes back to Rome and Athens.
This brings up a really fascinating debate within the source material itself, something I'll call the born in a barn debate.
Ah, yeah.
The old saying goes, just because you're born in a barn doesn't make you a horse. It's a slightly crude phrase used to imply that merely being born on a specific piece of dirt doesn't automatically grant you the cultural identity of that place. But Ralph Schawhammer, the guest, actually pushes back against the fatalism of Ibrahim's determinism here.
He does. He argues against the idea that assimilation across ethnic lines is biologically impossible. Schawhammer introduces a very specific hypothetical scenario to test the limits of cultural assimilation.
Let's hear it.
He says, imagine an Austrian baby. The parents tragically die, and the infant is adopted by a British couple and raised entirely in England. The child grows up immersed in British culture, speaks with a British accent, eventually fights in the British Army, and has British children.
Okay, so completely British upbringing.
Exactly. Schawhammer asks, at 45 years old, when this man finally discovers he has Austrian blood, does he suddenly stop being British? Is he still a chicken in a barn? His point is that human beings are not strictly bound by their genetic biology. True assimilation is entirely possible, but only if two strict conditions are met.
And what are those?
The host culture must confidently demand assimilation, and the immigrant must be entirely willing to adopt it.
I love that analogy because it forces us to look at the other half of the equation, which is the host culture.
Right.
Both hosts completely agree that assimilation requires a host culture that actually has strong, definable values to assimilate into. And this is the core of their immense frustration with the modern West. They argue that the West has completely abandoned its own values, essentially hollowing itself out and creating a massive cultural vacuum.
Yes.
They argue that modern Western nations are no longer cohesive peoples bound by shared destiny. They have degraded into mere supermarkets with laws.
The supermarket with laws analogy is incredibly potent.
It really is.
Think about how a supermarket operates. It is a purely transactional space. You walk in, you follow the basic rules, don't steal, wait in line, pay for your goods, and in exchange, you get what you want. You feel no deep familial loyalty to the other shoppers in the aisles. You wouldn't risk your life for the supermarket. The sources are arguing that this is what Western nations have become. They are massive GDP generators, driven by individual hedonism and consumerism.
Wow.
And if a nation is just an economic zone where people happen to live to make money, what exactly are immigrants supposed to assimilate into? You can't assimilate into a shopping mall.
Let's expand on that supermarket analogy, because what happens when a supermarket runs into trouble? What happens during a massive economic recession when the shelves go bare and the transaction breaks down?
Things fall apart quickly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If the only thing holding a diverse population together is material wealth and a legal code, then the moment the economy falters, the society fractures. There is no shared cultural bedrock to fall back on, no shared sense of sacrifice.
And if we connect this structural weakness to the bigger picture, the speakers argue that the West isn't merely failing to demand assimilation from newcomers. Its institutions are actively and intentionally telling migrants not to assimilate.
They offer two striking examples of European institutional behavior to prove this point, right?
Yes. The first is a public campaign run by the Council of Europe a few years ago. This was a campaign funded by European taxpayers, prominently featuring posters with slogans claiming that freedom is in hijab and beauty is in diversity.
And Schawhammer expresses absolute bafflement at this.
Complete bafflement.
He asks the listener to put themselves in the shoes of a conservative Muslim immigrant arriving in Europe. You arrive expecting to have to adapt to a secular liberal society, but the very first message broadcast by the European government is that the ultimate sign of freedom is actually your own traditional religious dress code.
It's totally backwards, Tim.
Yeah. The government is preemptively surrendering its own cultural norms and validating yours before you even unpack your bags.
And the second, even more intensive example is an EU-funded initiative called the Euro Quran Project. The source notes this received over 10 million euros in funding.
10 million euros.
Yeah. The source claims that the explicit goal of this project is to convince native Europeans that the Quran and Islamic philosophy have been a foundational part of the social and intellectual fabric of Europe from the very beginning, on par with Christianity and the Enlightenment.
But Ibrahim pushes back incredibly hard on the historical framing of this project.
He does.
He points out how institutions will twist historical facts to fit this modern multicultural narrative. For instance, the project might point to figures like the Archbishop of Toledo in the 13th century, who commissioned a translation of the Quran into Latin. The modern EU-funded spin is that this was an early, beautiful act of multicultural appreciation and interfaith dialogue.
But Ibrahim corrects the record.
Exactly. He states that the archbishop was translating the text to understand his enemy's ideological battle strategy because the Spanish Christians were in the middle of a brutal existential war with the Moors.
They make a very similar point regarding American history and Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, this was fascinating.
The source brings up the fact that Jefferson famously owned a copy of the Quran. Today, this fact is frequently cited by politicians and academics as definitive proof of the American founding fathers' enlightened, inclusive, and tolerant views on Islam.
Right.
But the source immediately clarifies the historical context.
Mm-hmm.
Jefferson acquired the Quran specifically to understand the motivations of his enemies, the Barbary pirates of North Africa, with whom the newly formed United States was fighting its very first foreign war over the enslavement of American sailors.
So they're taking a war tactic and calling it tolerance.
Precisely. The speakers argue that clear historical facts of conflict are being actively inverted, sanitized, and twisted by modern institutions to support a fabricated narrative. This narrative artificially elevates the incoming culture while deliberately denigrating the native European and American history.
So you have a situation where Western governments are essentially telling immigrants that their foreign culture is superior and foundational, while simultaneously telling their own native citizens that their history is uniquely shameful and built on exploitation.
It's a complete inversion.
It completely destroys any logical incentive for a migrant to assimilate. I mean, why on earth would you conform to a civilization that demonstrably hates itself? But that begs the most important question of this entire deep dive. Who is doing this listing?
According to our sources, this civilizational self-sabotage isn't some accidental byproduct of globalization. It is a highly lucrative institutional business model.
Let's unpack that, because to explain the psychology behind why the West is the only civilization in human history that actively disassociates from and despises its own ancestors and heritage, Schawhammer reaches back to a brilliant 1942 theory by the Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter.
Yes, Schumpeter. He wrote extensively about the inherent structural vulnerabilities of successful capitalist societies. His core theory was that capitalism is so incredibly efficient at generating immense wealth that it eventually allows a society to mass-produce what he called an overeducated elite.
I really want to spend some time on this overeducated elite concept because it is the engine driving their entire theory of institutional capture. What does the mass production of elites actually look like in practice, and why is it dangerous?
Well, in practice, it means that as a society gets richer, it sends a massive, unprecedented portion of its population to universities. These individuals graduate with advanced degrees, PhDs, master's degrees from prestigious institutions.
Okay.
Through this process, they develop a massive sense of entitlement and a belief that their intellectual superiority should guarantee them high social status and power. However, the harsh reality of the capitalist economy is that it cannot possibly offer all of them roles that match their perceived status.
There just aren't enough jobs at the top.
Exactly. There simply aren't enough high-prestige, high-paying intellectual jobs for every single university graduate.
So you end up with a massive class of brilliant, highly educated people who are essentially underemployed, deeply indebted, and culturally restless. They have the vocabulary of the elite, but not the bank accounts or the power.
Exactly.
And Schumpeter argued that human beings, especially educated ones, need to find meaning. They need a great historical task to accomplish in order to justify their existence and the decades they spent in school. In a post-industrial world where the great wars are fought and the basic standard of living is high, how do they find that meaning?
According to the theory, they find it by relentlessly attacking the very society that created them.
Wow.
The speakers argue that this psychological need for meaning has completely transformed the modern university. The university has supposedly morphed from a center of objective research and the preservation of knowledge into a taxpayer-funded center of political activism.
They state it pretty bluntly, don't they?
They do. The sources state their conclusion quite bluntly. Hatred of Western civilization is the business model of the university class.
Let's build an analogy here. Imagine a highly skilled mechanic who is hired to maintain a machine that is already running perfectly.
Okay.
If the machine runs perfectly, the mechanic is bored, irrelevant, and out of a job. So what does he do? He intentionally sabotages a perfectly good engine. He creates problems just so he can swoop in, charge you an exorbitant fee to fix it, and feel like the savior of the factory while doing it.
That's a perfect analogy.
The speakers are saying that if modern academics simply admitted that Western society, despite its flaws, was actually mostly well-run, egalitarian, and successful, they would have no life mission. They'd just be filing historical papers. Therefore, to maintain their status, they must constantly invent, exaggerate, and weaponize crises of systemic sexism, endless racism, imperialism, and colonialism to justify their degrees and assert their moral superiority over the working class.
And the source points specifically to the academic discipline of history as the prime evidence of this institutional corruption. Raymond Ibrahim argues that to successfully get a PhD in history today, or to secure tenure at a major university, you cannot simply recount established historical facts.
What do you mean?
If the broad historical consensus for centuries was that the relationship between the expanding Islamic world and the Christian West was largely one of violent conflict, conquest, and hostility, you cannot write a dissertation agreeing with that. You have to be groundbreaking. You have to invert the historical truth to advance your career.
The ultimate example they use to demonstrate this academic inversion is Edward Said's highly influential 1978 book, Orientalism.
Yes. The source claims this single book created a massive paradigm shift in the humanities. Said argued that Western scholars and authors had historically maliciously demonized the East, the Orient, to intellectually justify brutal colonialism. Meanwhile, the book portrayed Islamic history as largely misunderstood, harmless, and enlightened. The sources argue this book gave an entire generation of academics permission to rewrite history, to cast the West as the eternal villain.
They also point to the rampant academic romanticization of the Andalusian or Cordoban Golden Age in Islamic Spain.
They do. In modern Western academia, this era is almost universally heralded as a shining utopia of interfaith tolerance, artistic flowering, and scientific advancement, where Muslims, Jews, and Christians lived in perfect harmony.
But the source claims that this modern academic narrative is a deliberate fiction that conveniently ignores severe historical persecution.
Right. They specifically cite the Martyrs of Cordoba, a group of native Christians who were executed by the state for religious offenses under Muslim rule. The argument is that modern academics willfully cherry-pick data and spin history to delegitimize Western heritage while elevating foreign ones, all to maintain their status as cutting-edge, progressive intellectuals fighting against traditional narratives.
And we can see how this anti-heritage mentality bleeds directly from the ivory tower of the university straight into the halls of government power. The speakers bring up the drafting of the European Constitution a few years ago.
Yes, this was a massive, bureaucratic document, hundreds of pages long, detailing trade regulations and human rights.
And the Polish delegation, representing a deeply Catholic nation, simply asked for a non-binding preamble that acknowledged Europe's undeniable Christian roots. Just a single historical nod to the religion that built the continent's architecture and laws.
But the enlightened, secular European politicians vehemently and aggressively refused to include it. They argued that Christianity had absolutely nothing to do with their modern, secular identity.
Which the sources find deeply hypocritical, but entirely consistent with Schumpeter's theory.
Exactly. The very same European institutions that find it repulsive to acknowledge their own Christian history are simultaneously handing out €10 million grants to projects that claim the Quran is foundational to Europe.
Look, I have to pause here and challenge this worldview. Because it is a fascinating psychological and sociological theory, but does it truly hold up to scrutiny?
It's definitely a bold claim.
The speakers are essentially claiming that the entirety of progressive politics, the push for multiculturalism, and the vast field of modern sociology is just a massive psychological cope for underemployed PhDs who need to feel important. Isn't that a massive oversimplification of incredibly complex generational shifts in morality? Are millions of voting citizens genuinely just being blindly led by a bored, overeducated elite throwing a tantrum because they aren't rich enough?
Whether one finds it to be an oversimplification or a brilliant diagnosis, it is the crucial load-bearing gear in the machinery of their worldview. It is the only way they can explain why the institutional betrayal is happening. They refuse to believe the West is naturally committing suicide. They believe it is being poisoned by its own elite.
Which naturally leads to the next more urgent question. If these elites have successfully weaponized the education system and captured the cultural institutions, how does this translate to actual, hard political power? And more importantly, what does this mean for the future functioning of democracy itself?
Right, because if the university elites have created this anti-heritage business model, how does that actually escape the campus and rewrite national law?
That requires a fundamental shift in how democracy works. This brings us to the most unsettling part of their analysis. Their view on democracy, the definition of the demos, and the shifting Overton window. The sources take a very hard, almost Machiavellian look at the mechanics of political change. They make a historical argument that should make any believer in pure democracy pause.
And what's it?
Historical change is almost never driven by a 51% Democratic majority.
No, they argue forcefully that history is driven by a highly dedicated, often ruthless 20% minority who simply want it more. They cite the American Revolution to prove this point, noting that declaring independence and going to war with the British Empire was absolutely not the majority position of the colonists initially.
It was pushed by a radical minority.
Yes, they cite the Bolsheviks in Russia and the Jacobins in the French Revolution of 1789. In all these historical pivot points, a highly organized minority who possessed an unyielding will to power essentially dragged the passive majority along with them. The speakers apply this historical mechanic to modern demographics, warning that conservatives who are sitting around waiting for an ideological group to reach 51% before recognizing a societal shift are relying on a foolish, fatal misreading of history.
And this leads them to heavily question our modern, very loose bureaucratic understanding of the word democracy. The root of democracy is demos, which means the citizen body, the people. The speakers argue that a true demos cannot just be a random collection of economic units who happen to be standing within certain geographical borders at a given time.
Right.
To function, the demos must be deeply tied to the land, the shared history, and the ancestral culture of the nation.
To illustrate the absolute absurdity of how the West legally defines citizenship today, Schawhammer uses a provocative thought experiment about birthright citizenship.
The airplane one.
Yeah. He asks the listener to imagine a pregnant woman from Mexico. She steps onto a commercial airplane flying to Canada. While the plane is briefly flying through United States airspace, she goes into labor and gives birth. Under current, strict interpretations of U.S. constitutional law, that child is instantly an American citizen.
Which just sounds wild when you put it like that.
Schawhammer argues that the ancient Greeks, the very inventors of democracy, would find this legal loophole utterly insane. The idea that someone with absolutely zero cultural, historical, linguistic, or familial tie to a nation has an equal democratic vote to someone whose ancestors fought and died to build the nation fundamentally destroys the concept of a cohesive, functional demos.
If citizenship is just a geographical accident, then the nation means nothing. And while the definition of the demos is being diluted through immigration law, the political left, according to our sources, is masterfully manipulating the remaining public via the Overton window.
They actually express a dark, grudging sort of admiration for how effectively the political left operates. They explain this using the analogy of the boiling frog and the relentless moving of political goalposts.
Let's look at the mechanism of how they move the Overton window, which is basically the range of ideas tolerated in public discourse. They argue that the left takes highly radical fringe positions. The specific example used in the source is the fierce debate over allowing biological transgender athletes to compete in women's sports, and through media repetition and institutional validation, forcefully declares them to be the new, unquestionable normal baseline. And by doing this, they execute a brilliant tactical maneuver. They force regular common-sense citizens into a defensive posture.
Right.
Suddenly, if you hold a position that was entirely mainstream and universally accepted just 10 years ago, you are forced to defend yourself as if you are the dangerous radical extremist. They use their cultural power to make the radical normal and the normal radical. This is where the paranoia or the cold political reality, depending on how you view the world, really sets in. The sources fear the existence of a shadow government or an unaccountable NGO complex. They claim that even when conservative, right-leaning populist politicians actually manage to win national elections, they specifically mention George W. Bush or Donald Trump's first term. They hold office, but they do not hold actual power.
That distinction between office and power is vital to their worldview. Real day-to-day power, they argue, is wielded by unelected non-governmental organizations, entrenched civil servants, and institutional bureaucracies that actively thwart and slow-walk populist movements regardless of who the voters put in the presidency.
And they give concrete examples of this state-level interference.
They do. In Germany, they claim the state indirectly funds far-left groups like Antifa to physically shut down and intimidate the party conventions of the right-wing AfD party, using proxy violence to suppress political opposition. In France, They point to the sudden, highly convenient legal targeting of Marine Le Pen by the judiciary, just as she gains real political momentum. The overarching argument is that the permanent state apparatus, the bureaucracy, is actively trying to prevent any democratic reversal of the multicultural progressive agenda.
They also examine the concept of patriotism itself through a deeply partisan lens, citing a Gallup poll to prove their point. According to the source, when you poll Republican voters, their pride in being American remains relatively steady and high, regardless of whether a Republican or a Democrat is sitting in the White House. Their patriotism is tied to the nation itself.
Right.
But when you poll Democrat voters, their patriotism allegedly spikes dramatically when their chosen candidate is in power and plummets into the basement when a Republican is president. The speakers use this data point to suggest that the progressive left lacks a foundational, unconditional love for the country itself. Their loyalty is strictly conditional on holding the levers of power.
So we have to follow this logic to its absolute conclusion. What is the end game, according to this worldview? If the demographics continue to shift dramatically, if the universities continue to churn out anti-Western elites who hate their own heritage, and if the permanent bureaucratic state continues to thwart the democratic will of the native populations, where does this all inevitably lead?
The sources offer a deeply grim, almost apocalyptic prediction. They warn that if the state continually and overtly sides with non-citizens over natives, if the justice system, the police, and the politicians are perceived as abandoning the very people whose ancestors built the country in favor of newcomers, then citizens will entirely lose trust in the social contract.
And when trust in the state evaporates, when the supermarket closes, human beings revert immediately to their default historical setting, pure tribalism.
They predict that if citizens feel they can no longer rely on the government to protect their culture, their property, or their physical safety, they will bypass the state and fall back on ancient family and tribal networks for protection.
This, the sources warn, is the logical, unavoidable trajectory toward vigilantism and eventually open civil conflict. They argue it's not a matter of anyone actively desiring violence. It is simply a matter of basic human nature asserting itself when the artificial bonds of the modern state are broken.
Let's take a deep breath and synthesize the massive, turbulent journey we've just taken through this source material. We have meticulously mapped out a worldview that is intense, uncompromising, and highly influential. In this paradigm, demographics are not just shifting numbers on a dry census report. They represent an existential, zero-sum civilizational clash. Multiculturalism is viewed not as a beautiful tapestry of diversity, but as a suicidal illusion pushed by elites. And the institutions meant to protect Western heritage are seen as having been entirely hijacked by class intent on destroying it to find their own twisted sense of meaning.
The value of this exercise cannot be overstated. Whether you, the listener, find these arguments to be compelling and prophetic, terrifyingly xenophobic, or fundamentally flawed logically, this exact narrative is out there. These specific fears about demographic replacement, the deep resentment toward an overeducated elite, the profound feeling that the state has abandoned the native demos. This is the engine driving major earth-shaking geopolitical movements right now. You cannot effectively navigate modern politics. You cannot understand why election results in Europe or the U.S. are shocking the establishment. And you cannot engage in meaningful debate without thoroughly understanding this vocabulary and the underlying architecture of this worldview.
You have to know what the other side sees when they look at the world. Which brings me to a final thought I want to leave you with, something to mull over that builds on the source's profound critique of the materialist paradigm. If the sources are right that a nation cannot survive merely as a supermarket with laws, if shared economics, a good GDP, and legal codes aren't enough to bind a diverse people together during hard times, then what is the modern glue of a diverse society? In an era of unprecedented global migration and instantaneous interconnectedness, can a nation forge a newly unified identity out of shared future goals and democratic ideals? Or are we inevitably, biologically and psychologically, bound to the cultural and religious roots of our past? If the supermarket model is failing, what replaces it? It's a question that goes far beyond a single social media post of a kindergarten classroom, and it's a question the 21st century is going to be forced to answer. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.